Welcome back, Spacers, to another installment of One Perfect Game, the series where I endeavor to find the best experience that gaming has to offer. Now, let me be clear, nothing is truly perfect. Everything has its flaws, and I think that's what makes it so special. This series highlights those that I believe are a cut above the rest, and though I may have my own list of games, I'm a firm believer that everyone has their own perfect game. Dead Space could be one of them. An iconic step in the path of the survival horror genre that only a few months ago finally got a well-earned remake. But does the remake hold up? Out of the list of perfect games, does the Dead Space remake have a place among them? What do you think?
Ishimura on their 34th successful planet, correct? What was that?
Alright, so the Dead Space remake did... Wait, hold up, let's rewind a bit.
Oh, that's hot. That's hot.
The remake is good. It's fantastic, but it wouldn't be as good as it is, hell, it wouldn't even exist without the original game. I think it's only fair to pay homage to the OG, as most of the remake's strengths are due to the groundwork that the original set up.
Well, hang on, you've just...
No, I like it. This is brilliant. But I like this.
Yep, I'm talking about Dead Space 2008, made by Visceral Games. Don't worry, I'll try to keep it brief. Just let me know if I get a little carried away, alright? Dead Space is a perfect game. It introduces us to Isaac Clarke, a space engineer and our silent but deadly protagonist as he treks through the USG Ishimura, struggling to both fix the damaged flagship and fight against the alien infestation that plagues it. Ammo is scarce and enemies are plenty. You'll need both your wits and the full utilization of your arsenal in order to reunite Isaac with his loved one Nicole and escape this terrible fate. Now, if that's not a premise that gets you pumped for the game, I honestly don't know what to say. Maybe I'm just bad at explaining it, but the moment I saw the original game, I was sold. I mean, as a kid, I was like, yeah, we're in business. I put my Turtle Beaches on, I turned off all the lights, I was locked in. Start to finish, the game was the absolute shit, man. It's easy to see why. The atmosphere, for one, is incredible. The Ishimura essentially feels like its own character that is alive and dying, and it's up to you to get it back into working order. Each corner dares you to turn it, every hallway having you think it'll be the last one you ever cross. It's a staple for survival horror, and I haven't even mentioned the gameplay yet. At the start of the game, you feel cornered, underpowered, and vulnerable. The enemy force is incalculable, and you're just some engineer. You're not some seasoned veteran. You're no Doom guy, you're just guy. You don't have much to you. Only a plasma cutter that you hope still works, and an engineering rig that Isaac probably picked up from the dollar store. Hell, even by the end of it, despite having a full arsenal of weaponry at your disposal, you'll still need to be smart, or your next shot may be your last. The alien forces are more than just standard zombies. They're monsters, beings of destruction, literally biogenetically designed to fuck you up. And they do. They did. To me. Many times.
It's brilliant because
And the story is not meant to be slept on either. A rescue story in the middle of an apocalypse interlaced with cult and body horror, a commentary on the pursuit of power, and a character study set in space. I'm sorry, but
Dead Space is the fucking shit!
dude, Dead Space is just so good. It was way ahead of its time. Won awards, Sorry about that. It's just good, okay? I told you to let me know if I got carried away. Look, by the end of it, Dead Space is a survival horror paragon that essentially gave the genre its definition, so for once, I'd say the decision of making the remake is entirely justified. Oh, the remake, yeah, we can talk about that. The Dead Space remake, 15 years after the release of the first and brought to life by EA Motive. Long story short, it holds up, and in more ways than one. The remake made a lot of changes and improvements, so for your convenience, I've cut it up to a couple categories to delve into. Let's do the presentation first. This one will be brief, but I had to do it first because the presentation of a piece of art is always going to be the first and initial impression you receive. This is what matters. This is what's important when it comes to audience and player retention. If you can't grab them, there's nothing to hold on to. And was I immediately drawn to the intro of this remake? It was almost exactly like the original game. The mission log, the Kellyon bursting out of slip space, the reveal of the Ishimura, all the same beats were there, and yet it was still new. In no time flat, this game shunted me back a decade where the only problems I had were playing a game that is considered too spooky and engaging in friendly debate with the upper echelons of society. And yet, despite providing this feeling of nostalgia, the remake still manages to maintain an air of mystery. For veteran players, you know exactly what you're getting into, because you've done it that before. But at the same time, you're sitting there thinking, what else do they have in store for me? And for the new players, well, you're just sitting there going like, yeah, that ship looks cool. I bet everyone's all nice and well in there. Definitely nothing bad going on in there, one would hope. I can't wait to fix the ship and go home safely for sure. And I think that's just great. Because even though the biggest point of a remake is to revitalize an old treasure for the sake of the fans, something often overlooked is that it's also meant to introduce itself to people that never got the chance to play the original. And to make sure it's just as authentic, you have to get the presentation right. If you don't capture that first 10-minute essence that captivated audiences over a decade ago, you can say goodbye to your remake. And I think, on that front, the remake delivered well. It was close to the original while also keeping it fresh. Isaac is talking now, which is a point I'll get to later. The crew of the Kellion is well established from the get-go, as well as some early tension among them. Isaac proves himself immediately to be worthy of his position, and we're quickly warmed up to him as a character, and the exposition delivered is just enough to both familiarize us with the world and make us eager for more.
Isaac, try that security.
The mission goes south and bam, the presentation's over, it's on to the game. Despite how a game is presented, it still needs to feel right and play well. And thankfully the integral gameplay that made the original Dead Space so great is still intact. It's improved upon in just about every way. Just think of a part of the gameplay in the original that you enjoyed, and there's a good chance I could tell you that it's been improved on for the case of efficiency, convenience, or just plain making it cooler. And what better place to start than the combat? Dead Space has always been ahead of the curve when it comes to survival horror combat, and it has a lot to do with its strategic approach. For example, instead of taking the standard route and just having the main character shoot the enemy, you need to carefully and deliberately dismantle them. Necromorphs are not defeated by simply firing at the hip and hoping it lands. You need to cut off their limbs, and that's only for the standard ones. Dead Space has a crazy amount of enemy variety that are ready to tussle, and they are not messing around. You have lurkers, who you need to destroy their tendrils as they appear, brutes, which you need to freeze in stasis so you can get behind them and shoot a vulnerable area, infectors, which you need to kill before they create more powerful necromorphs off of corpses, dividers, which divide into smaller, faster creatures after taking too much damage, twitchers, which do this. There's even these guys that if you deal too much damage to them, they'll start stabbing their own stomachs to release smaller creatures which will eat you alive. Actually, what are these guys called? Stomach... stabby... guys... Space. No. That's terrible. You're essentially doing mental math, switching from strategy to strategy as a new enemy is thrown into the mix, which can be grueling as some levels really test that notion. There are parts of the game where you walk into a room and are forced under a quarantine zone.
Oh shit.
You can't leave until the threat is neutralized, and that threat is usually a massive horde of necromorphs. It backs the player into a corner and forces them to rely on their most natural instincts of survival. The only means of escape is to win, and there's nothing quite like that moment's rest when it's finally over.
Lifted.
Yeah, don't get used to that. In order to keep doing this though, to keep winning, you'd best hope you're properly equipped to do so. Thankfully, you absolutely are. Now, in the beginning, not so much, but as you progress, you start to gain and find more means of stopping the infection, one shot at a time. Good thing too, because you're eventually gonna get tired of that really loud brass ensemble that just blares in your ear every time you die, as if to remind you how much you fucked up, like I didn't know already. It's as if they're standing right behind you as you're just sitting there with sweaty hands, self-disappointment creeping in, not knowing it's
Okay, I get it.
There are a variety of weapons to choose from, and they all serve their own purpose, some of them being a good folly to the multitude of different necromorphs that you'll face in the game. The remake has all of the same weapons that the original did, but I actually feel like Motive managed to make the weapons more useful. Now the reason why I say this is because when I played the original, I really only used the plasma cutter and the pulse rifle, the first two weapons you receive in the game. Back then I felt like the other weapons never really had as much of a punch, or just weren't as effective, I don't know. This time around though, I found myself using just about everything. Each weapon feels unique and useful for a specific situation or enemy, and their usage along with the effect on the enemy is very visceral and impactful when you see it. You really get the sense that someone shouldn't be using this, which in this state of the game is the perfect time to use it.
Yeah, boy.
On top of making the weapons better, Motive also added an extended upgrade tree for all of them, which includes statistical upgrades and a handful of modifications to change the way you play. Not only this, but each weapon has an alternate fire mode, which increases their versatility to an astronomical level. I think my favorite alternate mode is the pulse rifles, typically just a regular regular rifle, but you can fire a mine alternatively that causes a large explosion when an enemy approaches it. You can also just say fuck it and shoot the mine at the enemy, which is just a grenade launcher with extra steps. With all of these aspects in mind, I truly feel like they perfected the weapon system here, unlike Dead Space 3 where I believe it was overdone. In Dead Space 3, they added a fully craftable and customizable weapon system, and while that was cool in its own way, it sacrificed having a solid and reliable weapon wheel, and forced the player to rely on needlessly crafting and hoarding different materials, which really muddled the loot system and overall flow of the game.
Know your fucking place.
You might have thought that he was about to say trash, but this time, that isn't the case. Dead Space 3 isn't a bad game. At times, it can even be considered a good one. It has engaging action. The weapon crafting has its own unique merit, and it brought in the ability to play with a friend. However, Dead Space 3 is indicative of a time when games started to reek of corporate meddling. In this video essay, I will explain how.
At the same time, the upgrade system in Dead Space 1 was too simple. I think Motive found a good middle ground for the remake, making the weapons more customizable, but also having a solid base to work off of. At the end of a playthrough, you're just this walking arsenal of a guy, setting traps, switching to weapons that fit the situation, and essentially playing the role of an undead hunter. And should your weapons somehow fail you, if you don't have any ammo left, all hope is not lost. You can still use the environment to your advantage, taking apart bits and pieces of tables, shelves, and other objects and using them as javelins. But enough about the weapons. After all, Isaac is first and foremost the brains, not the brawn. He's not an engineer for nothing. Dead Space isn't and never was a puzzle game, but the remake still offers a handful of small and rudimentary puzzles to work through as Isaac goes about fixing the ship. Each puzzle is roughly the same at its core, but they all have a few significant changes for either the sake of convenience or just overall enjoyment. There are even some new puzzles, as well as some that were just replaced entirely for something that better fits the more modern game design. For instance, I'd say my personal favorite example is the revamp of the ADS sequence. In both games, the ADS, or Asteroid Defense System, goes offline, and the ship starts getting bombarded by nearby asteroids as there's no system to defend it. In the original game, Isaac recalibrates the system by going out to the ADS cannon and manually firing it. While this was really cool at the time, it never really felt like more than a minigame. Just point and shoot and that was it. In the remake, however, the entire spaceflight system has been revamped to reflect the later games in the series, adding more flexibility to the gameplay while you're out in the vacuum of space. This addition allows the ADS section to also be changed, with the remake having Isaac recalibrate the cannons to fire his own shots instead of him manually sitting on the cannon and firing it. Not only is this more fun, it turns it into more of a balancing act instead of a minigame, because while you're doing this, you need to keep track of your oxygen level, defeat surrounding enemies, and also be sure that the ship's hull isn't damaged from the asteroids. Once again, the player is backed into a corner and is forced to take care of multiple things at one time. Sure, it's a point of stress in the game, but it's also the game faithfully putting this issue in your hands and trusting you to fix it. But what made this possible? Remember how I said that the flight system was changed? One thing, if anything, that I feel that the original was always lacking in was space. You know, that space part of Dead Space. It's not like it was ever bad, but maybe it was just outdated or a little too simple. Isaac's movement in space was very stiff, and he didn't really do much in it other than run from one airlock to the other and hope he didn't run out of oxygen. The original devs, Visceral, rest in peace, understood this and changed the system for the better in Dead Space 2, and added free spaceflight, but I always wished that this system was brought over to the original game. And now, thanks to the team at Motive, that's been done. Not only did this decision improve the overall quality of the game, it also paved the way for the addition of new sections and the revamping of other parts of the level design, like the ADS. The remake remembers the space part of Dead Space, and the decision to bring the spaceflight aspect of the later games into the first is one of the best decisions the remake could have made. Another one of those great decisions is the choice to bring in side missions. Now, I know what you're thinking.
Wait a minute.
This day and age, the idea of side missions makes me want to hurtle myself into the Ishimura 2 as soon as possible.
Preston, if another settlement needs my help, I swear to God.
Sometimes it seems like there's really only a handful of modern games that can actually do side missions right, and I think you know which ones I'm referring to. Now, the Dead Space remake doesn't have Witcher 3 level side quests, and not even close. Don't worry, its time will come. But it isn't busy work either. It's not collect 238 necromorph eyeballs and deliver them to Professor Burgle for the pizza alternate skin of the plasma cutter. I'm sorry. That's what I wrote in the script. That's just too good. There are only 3 of them, and they serve as both a narrative booster and an avenue for the player to get additional loot should they run dry. 2 of them also just happen naturally. You really only have to go out of your way for the 1 if you want to, so I'm really just calling them side missions because the game deems them so. I think the fact that it's possible to accidentally complete them without ever looking at the mission log should tell you enough. They're not in the way, they're engaging with the narrative, and they add complexity to the otherwise relatively linear story path, so hey, big kudos to Motive on this one. Now here's something cool about this that players might not have noticed. In the original game, you could only take the tram to where the story wanted you to go. Now, however, side missions not only make it possible, but necessary to go back to different sections of the ship in order to complete them. And it's all on the player's dime. So long as the story has taken Isaac there at least once, you can choose to take the tram to revisit it. This impacts more than you think. With the introduction of backtracking, Motive needed to cover all their bases. After all, it would kinda suck to go back through a level you cleared out and just see nothing, right? Enter what Motive calls the Intensity Director. Why did it do that? Alright, yeah, okay, whatever. Anyway, the Intensity Director. What is that? What is that? Okay, I'm just gonna forget about it. The Intensity Director is a mechanic introduced by Motive to make the game more unpredictable. Depending on certain factors, the game itself decides where to spawn enemies and script jump scares, making it near impossible to predict through subsequent playthroughs. Have you caught on yet? Other than having one of the most metal names in mechanic design, the Intensity Director allows the game to randomly spawn encounters throughout the ship, so that going back through an area after beating it does not mean you were safe to do so. I mean, take a look at this for instance. On my first run through this area, I encountered this jump scare. I died shortly after and expected to see the same on my second go, but was instead greeted with something entirely different. It's also just as likely that I wouldn't encounter anything at all, and keep in mind, at the time I had no idea that the Intensity Director was even a thing. Even without looking anything up, the game was telling me that I needed to expect the unexpected, ensuring that no 2 playthroughs are exactly the same. I cannot stress how both intelligent and thoughtful this is. It's so simple, but it's so effective, and this is all because of the addition of side missions. Whether it was intentional or not, the chain of cause and effect is palpable here. Adding side missions creates demand for backtracking through levels, which identifies a need to generate fresh encounters, bringing about a dynamic event mechanic which, when applied to the entire game, increases the replayability value tenfold. Wow! So when I tell you the gameplay is good, it's good. Gameplay is the core of every game, and it can be as simple or as complex as you want, but ultimately you have to make it work. You have to prove that yours is a game worth playing, and this remake gets it. Motive understands the magic of Dead Space to a T, somehow granting us an even better experience than we could have asked for, and I'll bet a great deal of audiences didn't even notice. That's how you make a game. God, it's so good.
I gotta get out of here! Where's Cole? Where is anything? Where?
When remakes are put into question, I think the first thing people think of, myself included, is how the game looks graphically. It's a no-brainer, really. Remakes and remasters are made to bring the old into the new, like a fresh coat of paint.
Hi, Billy Mays here for—
And while this is true, what separates a remake from a remaster is that everything is redone. It isn't just a texture or sound update, the house is being rebuilt brick by brick.
Board by board!
So the importance of a remake lies in every aspect of its design. How it looks, how it sounds, how it feels, it's all important. Environmentally, the game is absolutely stunning, and I'll start with the Ishimura, the main location of the game. Though the game takes place far into the future, the Ishimura is an old ship. It's the oldest of her class, actually, and if it wasn't falling apart before the infestation, it's definitely doing so now.
What the hell is this?
As I mentioned before, this derelict rust bucket is one false maneuver away from blowing up, and you can feel it every step of the way. The attention to detail here is staggering. Everything is in its own state of disrepair, and you can almost see how it turned up that way by just observing the destruction, some of which you're present for.
this. That's just gonna be broken.
Each part of the ship feels very fleshed out and relatively distinct from one another, and you can tell what parts of the ship were the hardest hit by the infection very clearly, as they are severely affected by some strange organic growth. There's also a very clear distinction between areas that are for more standard workers and then for those of higher rank in the crew. Gotta love that glaring preferential treatment. You can really feel that people have been here and lived here, which is really important in establishing the pre-apocalyptic part of survival horrors. Each and every area of the ship feels lived in and affected by people in some sort of way. You can tell that people have been here before, and you can even get a grasp of what they were doing. A good example of this is the flight lounge, the first area of the game. It's a chaotic display, with tickets, luggage, and belongings strewn about the area like people were trying to leave in a hurry. And it isn't long before you see why. Even worse is the waiting room in the medical deck. It's a testament to the last days of the infection, with a full center of incurable patients and a waiting room with not enough space. I'll touch more on this later, but Dead Space always excelled at its environmental storytelling, and the remake is no different. In fact, it's better. The player is constantly filled with this sense of overbearing dread, paired with a post-mortem sense of sonder, realizing that though people were once here, they're either dead or worse. And yeah, it kind of gets to you if you think about it too long. Maybe it's just me, but it has a certain effect that is palpable. That said, how the player feels has a lot to do with the pacing of the game. The survival horror genre is all about the flow of a game from level to level, making sure that it stays spooky and never loses its rhythm. I briefly touched on this when I was talking gameplay, but since it's in the name, I feel it has its place here. Level design is important. It's a crucial element that makes sure a game never feels boring or drawn out. At first, I'll admit I was a little worried. Some remakes can get a little carried away and throw out too much of what made the original so great, but there are no worries here. A lot of the Dead Space remake is going to be instantly recognizable to its veteran players. In fact, I often found myself saying something to the extent of, "Oh, it's that road," because even though it was updated, I knew exactly where I was, and how fucked up I was soon gonna be. But hey, I know, it isn't just copy and paste. As you've seen, the remake still adds some new rooms here and there to keep it fresh, and also introduces a couple of different things to the mix to both make things interesting for the player and accommodate for some of the other design changes, like the zero-G system. Something I really like are these new fuse exchange sections. I know it doesn't sound appetizing, I know. 10 out of 10 game, love the fuses. Every now and then, the player will find themselves at a fuse box that essentially lets you decide where to divert power in the nearby area. Since the ship's resources and effectiveness is essentially the equivalent of the AOL dial-up, you have to sacrifice one in order to get another. Here's an example, and my personal favorite. Early on in the game, you need to get into a maintenance room for a data board. There are 3 fuse slots: the elevator, the lights, and the maintenance room door. You can only have 2 on at a time, but you need the elevator to get out and down to the room, and in order to get to said room, the door has to be operable, so the lights have to go. I can't tell you the kind of dread that settled into my mind as I realized I needed to shut them off. It's this design choice that masks itself as the player's own decision, like if the game is asking you if you truly have the balls to do it. In order to move on, you have to make the conscious decision to cut the lights, and I'll reiterate from earlier, I bet a lot of other players did not even bat an eye at this. The remake has this subtle tendency to push boundaries in the best way possible, and maybe I'm thinking too much into it, but damn, it was such an effective design choice. It's gonna stick with me for some time. Another part of the level design that I enjoy is the object placement and interactivity. Almost any and every object is interactable. The game even encourages the player to dismantle things like tables and the like to use as weapons in case you run out of ammo, which happens quite a lot. If you are so inclined, you can also attempt to use other aspects of the environment to your advantage, like how I improvised in this part of the game, using kinesis to guide a lit flare through a dark portion in order to see. Look at this, dude. Look at the way that this looks, man. It's just, God, it's so cool. God. There's always this constant sense of purposeful design and placement. Every location, every wall, every corner of every room feels lived in and entirely intentional. That said, though, the true draw to survival horror is the horror itself.
You might have thought that he...
It's really no surprise, the scares will bring us back to the genre time and time again, and the remake doesn't disappoint. Now, it does take a bit to scare me these days. I don't mean to brag, but when it comes to Dead Space, I'm a bit of a seasoned vet. I know what I'm doing. I know what's what. It takes a bit to scare me, okay? No, thank you. Yeah, no. You don't want to mess with this guy. But the remake did get me. It spooked me quite a few times. Most of the scares aren't in the same place as the original. The intensity director. Hey. The intensity director shook things up a bit, and despite it being a remake, Motive managed to create a fresh horror experience that still surprises some die-hard Dead Space fans, so yeah, it's got it down. I wasn't able to get a clip of me being scared by the game, as I recorded my footage without my mic, so for the sake of the video, I recreated this for you.
That sure was scary.
I'm not much of an actor. My favorite element of design, however, one that many may agree with, is sound design. Arguably the most crucial part of the survival horror genre, sound design ensures that the player is always on high alert, and only feels safe when the cruel mistress that is Dead Space deems it so. Sound is immersive and enticing, and it brings you further into the experience with every creak, bump, and groan, having you mistake your surroundings with adversaries, look behind you at every chance you get, and, in tandem with the game, questioning if what you hear is fact or fiction.
It's fiction.
The Dead Space remake takes the sound design of its predecessor to somehow even greater heights, but I know I'd be doing an injustice by simply talking about it. The best way for you to understand is to listen for yourself. Though I found that clip to be a good example, I could have scrolled through my recordings and selected a timestamp at random to prove my point. From beginning to end, the sound is just that consistently good. It never skips a beat. And I'm not just talking about the ambient sound. Isaac, for instance, makes a great deal of grunts, groans, and noises that are very reactive to his environment and situation. There is a complete, intricate system entirely based on how Isaac is physically doing and how he reflects that through the sounds that he makes. His BPM is statistically relative to that of an average male in his 40s, as Isaac is at the time of the game. His breathing is reactive to anxiety and fear, needs to catch his breath after almost losing oxygen, has 3 different dialogue variations reflective of healthy, fatigued, and injured, has an increasing or decreasing respiratory rate due to level of fatigue, winces in pain when injured, exertions that interrupt the breathing loop instead of playing over it. Are you seeing this? Are you kidding me? This level of design is just insane. Is this just me?
Did you see that? Did you see it? Did you see what? Wow.
Anyways, if you want to check out the full audio deep dive on this whole thing, they call it the A.L.I.V.E system. I'll link it down in the description below. We have down the designs of the environment, the levels, and the sounds. But what about the nitty-gritty? I'm talking about the models, the textures, the little intricacies that truly help the design strut its stuff.
This right here is my favorite thing.
I think the best place to look is at our main man, Isaac. Isaac's iconic look is iconic for a reason, and the remake doesn't take this lightly. On the contrary, they actually took it extremely seriously.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Motive has another deep dive video where they discuss the thought process of the design in Isaac's suit. They purposely designed it in a cost-efficient way to reflect the greediness of the CEC, the mining and trade corporation that Isaac works for. The suit's design avoids raw material like leather due to its rarity on Earth in the Dead Space universe, and instead uses low-cost synthetic material and cheaper metals that oxidize quickly. All of this was to reflect how real-world miners are typically under-equipped without much regard to their safety, and Motive used this as a basis under the assumption that the CEC would treat their workers the same. Are you seeing this? This is the difference between a project and a passion project. This is nuts, and that's just Isaac. The overall texture and modeling design of this game is just straight crazy. Every bit and piece of machinery looks very real and either overused or unattended to. Screens have this very realistic holographic look to them that even have their own RGB effect. Every metal and material showcases wear and tear, telling years of use. It's insane. They also downright nailed Isaac's face this time around. I mean, look at him, dude. This is young Gunner Wright to a T. Apparently people were having issues with the way he was modeled. How could you not like this? There are people saying that the one in the original looks more like Gunner Wright. Are you seriously saying that this looks better? What are you talking about? For the necromorphs, their bodies were designed with the decaying process in mind, adding dried blood, yellowing and eventually graying skin, pimples, blemishes, glassy, glaze over eyes, the works. Their anatomy was completely mapped out as well, so that even though they look the way they do, Motive could backtrack and see how they became that way, making sure that the body was properly affected in response to the deformation that it suffered. In addition, to make the dismemberment process always feel unique, all internal organs and parts of the body were made separately, in order to be able to have multiple different outcomes when the player decides to shoot a certain part of the body. If you want to know more, I'll again link the deep dive video in the description below. At this point in the video, I think it should be glaringly obvious just how much Motive cared about this remake. Design is a vital aspect to any game, and even original titles don't get this much attention to detail. It is without a doubt clear to me that Motive cares about Dead Space, and if somehow you still aren't convinced, I've got one more topic to broach. Narrative, the wild card of game creation. At times the most important part of a game, at others it's just some flavor to grease the wheel. Some games don't even have a story, and yet they reach undeniable success. But I'm sure if I asked, you'd have a couple of games in mind that told a tale you will never forget. Now Dead Space was never really known for its groundbreaking story, but it was a great setup for an otherwise fantastic game that emboldened the survival horror experience. Going into the remake, I expected much of the same for the story, if not the exact same. I mean, how do you change the narrative of an already cut and dried premise? Skeleton Crew goes to a massive, unresponsive ghost ship and finds it infested with monsters, all the while with the main character desperately trying to find his lost and potentially dead lover? I'm in, I'm down, let's do it.
Yes, ma'am.
As far as everyone was concerned, Motive wasn't even going to touch the narrative. I mean, there was no reason to change it, and yet they did. There aren't any massive changes, mind you. Beat for beat, it could still be considered the same. But the way the game was presented was really trying to make you think otherwise. The game starts like I mentioned before. The Callion comes out of slip space and we're introduced to the crew. The main three, Isaac, Kendra, and Hammond, are all there. But who are these two? Well, that's Chen, and that's Johnston. And I hear you, veteran player of Dead Space 2008. I don't remember the original. Who are they? They don't pass my vibe check. I don't know them. And you are right to think in this way.
Although that was a little aggressive, so just chill out a bit.
Chen and Johnston didn't even exist in the original game. They were actually just two dudes, nameless, 2 or 3 lines. Hell, the game doesn't even list them as primary assets in the mission log. Then they die, and none of the characters talk about their deaths even once. In the remake, not only both Chen and Johnston listed in the mission log, but they have more lines, definable personality traits, and a recurring, albeit depressing, stake in the story. Now, sure, they die in just about the same way, but the main 3 actively mourn their deaths, and Hammond's entire character arc is centered around his loss of duty as their commanding officer. It's not the biggest change, but I'd say it was an important one. I think it displays the stakes of the situation much better than the original game. By giving us likable named characters and then killing them off almost immediately, the game tells us that no one is really safe. Whereas in the original, you watch 2 red shirts get killed off and think nothing of it.
Whatever, man.
By killing Chen and Johnston, the game sends up a big red flag, almost threatening that Kendra and Hammond could be next. And speaking of those two, Kendra and Hammond are handled much differently than one would expect. For Hammond, I feel they updated his character almost completely. In the original game, he's a gruff, seasoned officer that's just trying to do his job and get things done. He was good. Hammond's a G. I love him. But he wasn't really more than that. He was clear-cut, lacked depth, and died in a less than meaningful way. Memorable, but not very meaningful. In the remake, Hammond is much younger. You get the sense that though he's certainly earned his position, he's newer to the field and ultimately feels very responsible for the safety of his crew. It was his job to make sure everyone made it out okay, which is why out of the main 3, the deaths of Chen and Johnston affect him the most. I think Chen most especially. This is probably due to the fact that Chen, now turned into a necromorph, almost had some sort of vendetta against Hammond and hunts him down throughout the entirety of the game. You can tell that both this and the effect of the marker start to weigh on Hammond's mind heavily, because he starts talking about Chen as if he never died. Given that the marker tends to show people lost loved ones in an attempt to influence them the most, Hammond seeing Chen should tell you all you need to know about how much he really cared. He's headstrong and well-spirited, and a genuinely likable character from beginning to end, and at that end he manages to best the dementia instilled by the marker and sacrifices himself for the chance for Isaac and Kendra to escape, taking what remained of Chen down with him. If that isn't the perfect example of solid character justice, I don't know what is.
Hey, let's give a quick shout out to Hammond, huh? Love that guy. Come on, let's go, Hammond. Go Hammond. Yeah!
Now, about Kendra. You know, call me needlessly skeptic, but I was genuinely curious about whether or not Kendra was going to betray Isaac this time around. Not only did the remake actually make her likable,
because in the original she's terrible and I hate her,
but it also very subtly uses her to pit us against Hammond. In the intro, Isaac and Kendra seemed to have a good rapport with one another, while Hammond was a bit of an outlier. It's revealed that he was digging around the crew's personnel files to get more info on them, and seems to be a bit dodgy with questions, so he seems a little suspect at first. It had me second guessing who was going to be the traitor this time, if there was going to be one at all. After all, the game had already made a few noticeable changes, so why not do some more? In fact, Hammond goes radio silent for a decent couple chapters, so it's really just Isaac and Kendra for a good while. The remake does a great job of warming you up to her and making you more suspicious of Hammond, almost like the game itself is in on it. But fool me once, fool me twice. The traitor was Kendra yet again, and it still stings, but in a completely different way. In the original, she's very cocky about it and doesn't give a damn about Isaac. Like, yeah, got you, you little stupid, dumb little You just, fuck you. But in the remake, she lays everything out and almost seems apologetic. Maybe it's my bleeding heart, but hell, she wishes Isaac well and knows that he'll be able to find a way out because he's literally a mechanical genius and expert survivalist. And I'm not trying to excuse her behavior, but she's way less mustache twirling than she was before, and it makes sense why she'd be that way. I mean, her and Isaac built a pretty solid connection while they were working together, even if it was fake, so maybe there's some regret in there. And if you don't believe me, take a look at their last interaction.
Last warning, Isaac. I mean it.
Look at how she acts here. It would be so easy to pop Isaac in the head and run off, but she tells him to back off. She doesn't want to kill him, she's just doing what she was assigned to do. Then, on the verge of death, she reaches to Isaac for help, and Isaac obliges, because they were friends. Now look at the original. She looks at Isaac, says nothing, and the hive mind deletes her from existence. The remake manages to make the loss of someone who betrayed me sad. And I'm a vindictive bitch, so good job.
Isaac, it's me. I wish I could talk to you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything.
Nicole Brennan, the actual plot device of a character, criminally underused in the original game and whose entire existence was dedicated to character motivation for Isaac. I always thought there could have been more to her character, and the team at Motive seems to agree. The remake characterizes Nicole, making her innovative, intelligent, hardworking, exactly the kind of person expected for her job on the Ishimura. An entire side mission is dedicated to uncovering her hard work to stop the infection, documenting her every move as she desperately attempts to solve the problem. The game almost makes you think you're gonna find her, but the farther down the rabbit hole you go, the more you start to realize it's far too late. Quick pause for a sec. The diehard Dead Space fans might already know this, but during my research in this video, I found out that both the original and the remake did this really cool thing that if you take the first letters of every chapter title, it spells Nicole is dead, which is, it's just terrible and also awesome. I love little stuff like this. Okay, anyway, the game also delves further into her relationship with Isaac. Across the ship, you can find numerous texts, audio, and video logs that explore it in detail, one of which actually explains an abnormality that has bothered me for quite some time. Nicole's final message. In both games, she starts the message by saying she's sorry about everything. But sorry about what? Her death? The infection? The first game never quite explains it, and the remake actually clears it up through a video log. Before the events of the game, Isaac and Nicole had a falling out. A lover's quarrel, if you will. It ended on a bad note, and that was the last contact they had with one another. They never got the chance to make up, so our last message is not only a goodbye, but an apology, and that's... That's just heartbreaking to me on so many levels. Her last message opens with an apology, one that she may not know if he'll ever hear, and Isaac mentions throughout the game that he's meaning to apologize too, because he struck a chord and stepped out of line. But they just never get that chance, and Isaac has to carry that guilt with him for the rest of his days. Now, sure, you could just say that all of this emboldens the plot device part of her character, but giving her a personality, letting you in on their relationship, and then taking it all away in the saddest way possible is the best way to tell this kind of story. It helps the player care so much more, and also reminds us to tie up our own loose ends with someone before it's too late. And the narrative differences stretch far beyond the bounds of the main cast. I could go into depth about Dr. Mercer and Brent Harris, Dr. Cross and Jacob Temple, Dr. Kyne and his beloved Amelia. There's been so much of the additional story that's been touched upon. To go over it, I'd be here forever. All of this really makes the tragedy of the whole situation a lot harder to stomach, tapping into that post-apocalyptic grief that survival horrors can be known for, because you're traversing a graveyard made of steel, filled with broken dreams and lost hopes. But there's one man who makes it out alive. Well, granted you played it to the end. Isaac Clarke, the protagonist of the game. The man is iconic, belonging in the survival horror protagonist Hall of Fame. Literally the pure definition of Joe Schmo turned into Chad Brad. Isaac takes plot armor and has a field day with it. This man literally cannot and will not die, and we love him for it. And yet, there has always been one little thing about him that I've had issues with. It's just one, hear me out. Whoa, guys. Wait. See, in Dead Space 2008, Isaac is a silent protagonist. There's nothing wrong with the silent protagonist, mind you. It allows the player to put themselves in the main character's shoes and relate to them on an unspoken level. Literally. All things considered, that should be fine. I mean, some of my favorite games have protagonists that never speak, but Dead Space 2 and 3 changed this. See, as soon as Dead Space 2 starts, Isaac is a smooth-talking, wisecracking guy. And then, okay, that's fine, it's great, but why now? Well, the meta-reasoning is that the studio just wanted him to start talking, but we go on from there as if he was always like this, and to be clear, he wasn't. I mean, the wiki page itself gets me every time because the quote section for Dead Space 1 for Isaac only says grunts. Wait, he did what? 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 Hold on. What?
You dare raise your hand against a god? Explain yourself before I make you kneel.
I'm afraid I can't do that.
What? But yes, Isaac never speaking in the first game, and then suddenly having a complete personality change in the second was a bit jarring. Now you could argue that Isaac was actually mute, and after the events of the first game had a change of heart, and that's something I would agree with, but then it would be immediately retconned in Dead Space 2 and 3 when it said that he had no problem at all speaking before. It's revealed that Isaac wasn't mute, that he was just a regular guy that for some reason never spoke during the Ishimura incident, which would be the perfect time to start speaking as communication in such a stressful situation is paramount.
You're on camera, say something.
I really don't care that much about it, but it is really funny how it's just never explained, and so the community started coming up with just bullshit reasons as to why he didn't speak, such as his communicator being busted, chewing bubblegum throughout the entire game, or because he shit his pants at the beginning of the game and he's holding his breath out of fear that he'll taste it. Anyways, the reason why I went on that rant is because I think Motive agrees with me. Isaac has been fully characterized in the remake and he has never looked better, which is the final piece of the puzzle to make this game perfect. He's exactly the way you'd expect him to be. Gunnar Wright returns as Isaac to give another stellar performance, arguably his best, and his character is integrated so well you'd think it's always been like this. He's witty, intelligent, and doing more than pulling his weight, he's steering the ship. What I always found bothersome from the original game was that Isaac was just doing what everyone told him to do. Kendra and Hammond arguably did next to nothing. It was Isaac that was doing all the heavy lifting, and it was only because they told him to do it. I mean, look at this. They aren't even doing anything. They're just standing there. At least in the remake, they head off into the ship. Just do something. Isaac felt more like an errand boy than a protagonist. Isaac is an engineer. He doesn't just do what everyone else tells him to do. It always should have been him that has the knowledge and capabilities to fix the ship, and the remake puts that on full display. It's his ideas, his ingenuity that helps save the day. Fittingly, in order to help characterize Isaac without breaking the flow of the game, Isaac actually takes some of the lines said by other characters in the original that would be more adherent to his experience. Check the difference here.
Isaac, be careful. Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work. Go for the limbs. Dismember them. That should do the job. Isaac, don't bother shooting those fuckers in the head. Doesn't even slow them down.
Okay. The only way is hacking them apart. Those arms, legs.
Does that even kill them? Or do they just stop moving?
Instead of Hammond telling Isaac how to take down the enemy, it's Isaac that explains it, because at this point of the game, he's already done it a few times. It's an extremely simple but very effective change that displays not only Isaac's adaptability, but also his aptitude for action. Again, he's no super soldier, but he's the kind of guy that gets shit done. A protagonist whose personality makes perfect sense as how he would survive. He never gives up, and neither should we. The game even expands on Isaac's backstory, tailoring him to the plot by making his mother a former unitologist, one who was so devoted she killed Isaac's father and then herself, giving Isaac a more than warranted reason to hate unitology.
It didn't take you for a believer, Isaac.
My mother was. But if they found this on some alien planet, what does that mean?
That unitology's onto something?
Unitology's full of shit. Forget it.
This has a profound effect on his relationship with Nicole and the way he sees the world, and ultimately it just fleshes him out. I'm so glad to finally get to know about a character we've loved for so long, and his story feels expanded in a non-intrusive, completely believable way. The story of Dead Space was already memorable for me, but emboldening each character, broadening the universe, and giving Isaac a chance to truly shine just makes it a million times better. And that's all thanks to Motive storytelling. After all, sometimes the only thing you need to do in order to improve a story is just have it be told by someone else. The Dead Space remake. Though truly I've now said all I feel I wanted to say, I could have said more. I didn't cover everything. I could talk about this remake for hours because it's just that good.
But I think I made my point, and frankly, I bet you've heard enough already.
To those who fear that the Dead Space remake may fall prey to being another forgettable rehash, if I haven't convinced you enough, you can put your worries to rest. Motive said it was a game made by fans for fans, and I completely believe it. It is a reimagining that manages to shunt players back to their first playthrough, updating the game in all the best ways possible as if the game was first released today. It's a nostalgia that is traceable yet novelty, like using the same recipe but adding new ingredients. If you were ever to get a remake, this is the one you'd choose. So, where do we go from here? Is Dead Space truly revived? Well, not only did the studio straight up say that they're in discussions with EA on where to proceed with the IP, they also submitted a poll asking people if they wanted a Dead Space 2 remake, so there's that. The game itself also seems to drop a couple nods. A side mission hints towards the Brother Moons of the later games, there are a number of text logs and Easter eggs that suggest the greater, more sinister plots of Unitology, and there's even this moment in the USM Valor where you can see a soldier running through the ship in order to escape the blast. Some think it's just some environmental design, making the world feel fleshed out, but others have even suggested it could be Carver, the secondary protagonist from the third game. It's a little out there in terms of theories, but if Motive decided to flesh out his backstory more and have him be a survivor of the Ishimura tragedy, I'd be fine with it. Now, I'd say take most of it with a grain of salt, but it's there, and maybe we'll see a remake of the second game in the near future. Because, in all ways considered, the Dead Space remake was a resounding success, and we all know how much EA loves getting that bag. Nevertheless, this game is special to me. I extend my gratitude and appreciation for the team at EA Motive for their loving tribute to my favorite horror game of all time, and for creating a title that is what I consider to be one perfect game. I don't think I've ever spoken so much in my entire life. If you're still here, first, why? Second, thanks. I'm glad you found it worthy of your time, however long this video ends up being. This was definitely my most ambitious project yet, and likely the one that I've worked the longest on, so if you feel that it's deserving, give it a like. I'm a small channel, and I want to grow, and in such a competitive market, it's hard to do, but I believe the kind of content I make will prove worthwhile to those who stayed. Hopefully, this was for you. One Perfect Game is a series very dear to me, one that I wish to take forward and work on exclusively, at least for now. And with that said, these videos will take some time, but know that I'm always working on them. The Dead Space remake is a perfect game, but what do you think? Did I miss anything? Is there a game that you believe to be perfect, one that I should cover? Feel free to let me know down below and I might just add it to the list. I read every comment, and I always appreciate the feedback. With that said, I think that's everything. Stay tuned for the next one, Spacers, and subscribe for more. I'll be seeing you this rotation or next.